Let's start off in studio, Mr. George. Your reaction to today, it's a big day for workers.
Yes, the 1st of January 2019 will be remembered in the history of the country that Labour, business and government have taken a firm decision to take that right that employers had for many, many years away from them to set the minimum wages for workers, because we know that workers are vulnerable, and especially those workers with low-skilled workers, so they can be pushed to accept any wages that the employer offer. And that is the issue that the minimum wages is doing, is to introduce a mechanism that the state, labor and business can forthwith set the minimum wages and to also review the minimum wages in terms of inflation and so on going forward. So this is a major victory for workers. And from our side, we think, it's something very significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take you now to Katishi Masimola, who's on the line to us there. Mr. Masimola, your response to this implementation of the minimum wage. Dennis George telling us in studio that the 1st of January 2019 will go down in history for workers.
Well, let me start first by saying the principle of having a national minimum wage in the country is acceptable. We welcome it. And indeed, Dr. George is right that it is historic. However, where it is pitched, that's where ourselves as SAFTU and the federations like FEDUSA, COSATU and NACTU have differences. We think it has been pitched too low to can have a meaningful impact on the lives of the working poor. And that's where there is a problem between us.
Yeah, Mr. George, I mean, that's an issue that has come up time and time again as discussions around the minimum wage bill were going around. The fact that it's just not enough for workers.
Look, from our position is this. We always maintained that there is a difference between the minimum living wages and the national minimum wages. And what we've done was we've asked a panel of experts, including the International Labour Organization, to do some deep research for us. And what the research brought, and they brought it forward to us to say, look, at the amount of 20 rand an hour or 3,500 a month, that is a good starting point to start the process off. And as we're going forward and the system started to find its foot and its grounding, it would be important also for us to set the minimum wages on that level, on their recommendation. But on the other side, government also has to improve the social wages. Like, for instance, in areas where people work far distances from their workplaces, and that is very important because, it's no use we set the minimum wages at that level, and where workers need transport, the prices of that increase. But also not just about transport, but also about housing and also about medical aid for the workers.
And of course, food, clothing. We saw a VAT increase for the first time in decades in South Africa.
Yes, no, that is a serious challenge for all, and specifically that our country is now exposed to the global economy. So when the oil prices increase and the rand weakened against the dollar, then it means we have to pay more, like in 2018. Where we had also the government put up the levy on the fuel prices. It was hurting our people big time. So for us, this is good news. We believe going forward, and with the educational systems that we want to bring on board, that we want to do more for our people, but it has to be a step-by-step process.
Yeah. Mr. Masimola, your response to that, the fact that this is a start. Yes, it might not be everything that workers need, but it certainly is a good start.
Well, it is not a good start for us. It's supposed we shouldn't have lowered the bar too low, as it were. So we would have wished that the minimum wage was significantly higher than the 20 rand per hour, because 20 rand per hour, it's not just, enough a minimum. If a bread is about that price and people have to spend 40 rand buying 2 loaves of bread a day, 40 rand taken from about 160 rand daily wage. It's an issue. This country must soberly and seriously discuss where to pitch minimum wage for the benefit of the working poor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a difference between a minimum wage and a living wage, which is the exact point you were making.
Exactly. But look, if a person currently, there's about 6 million workers that will now find that their wages will now increase. to that amount. And that is something that you can argue today about whether it's too low or whether it's too high. But its significance is that 6 million workers will now benefit and they will earn more than what they earned before. And I think the mechanism is also put in place so that we can have a more inclusive process going forward where workers, employers can appear. But the one thing that we should not lose out of sight, and that is the issue of what happens if a company cannot really afford. Do the company just dismiss the person through a retrenchment process, or do we also build into the process flexibility where we can set a situation that the company can apply for an exemption? Because, when you make legislation in a capitalist environment, it's important that we must protect the workers. And that is what is critical for labor in NATLAC, that we protect the workers and that we make sure that nobody loses out in the process.
And of course, the next issue now is implementation. If we look at sectors of the economy like farm workers, domestic workers as well, first of all, there needs to be education around the fact that there is this national minimum wage now, and you should be paid 20 or 15 rand an hour in the case of domestic workers. But how do you go about then policing that?
I think the media plays a very big role in that process. On radio stations, on talk shows, where they're starting to inform people, look, this is what the minimum wages is. But what is also important to remember, many of the workers employ domestic workers. Like we have many teachers, for instance, and other professionals that employ domestic workers. So the salary of a teacher must also provide the income for a domestic worker. And that is something that is real. It's not something that you say, there's some rich person sitting in Sandton or a rich person sitting in Bantry Bay with millions and millions of rands and just try to pay the workers as little as possible. And that is what our research showed us. And that we must also respond to the research, but we must also educate our people. And I think from our side, the media will play a big role in doing that for us.
Mr. Masimola, some parting comments from you, perhaps, on what Dennis George has described, as I said, as a historic day for workers. What's your advice now to workers going forward on making sure that this is implemented?
Look, the current national minimum wage that is effective from today is a law. So we don't expect employers not to comply with this. We don't expect trade unions to be chasing employers to comply with this. If anything, we call on the Department of Labor to employ an army of inspectors who should ensure compliance to this minimum wage. Never mind, it's so low to us that it doesn't make a difference, but it has to be complied with because it's a piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your time. Before we perhaps end off this conversation, Dennis George, your comments now just on what Katishi Masimola has been talking about, the fact that it is so low. These negotiations that led up to the minimum wage being implemented today, do they now continue so that we can start talking about a real living wage?
Yes, what's happening now, before we start, reviewing, because there's a 2-year period, from now till that time, and the reviewing will start long before that time. So the most important thing is for the minister to release the regulation in terms of the implementation and the monitoring. There's also going to be a national commission that deals with the minimum wages be established. And those are all very important structures because, we want something where business and labor and government sit around the table, where we can argue our ideas, put forward research, and put ideas. But the fundamental issue is the protection of our workers, and that we also provide decent work for them. And then secondly, to that, it will also now create certainty for new companies that's coming in to know that is what the minimum wage is, so they can work their numbers into their business plans, and that we can make protection for our people. So from our side, we think today is a historical day for workers. Well,
all the very best to you, and a very happy New Year to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Dennis George joining us here in studio, and on the line to us, Katishi Masimola, as we talk about this historic day, the national minimum wage coming into effect from the 1st of January 2019.